Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's discussion. We are going to be talking about grit. So I will read our discussion prompt, and I'm here with Kamara and Sandra, and we will all be talking about this shortly. So grit is a contentious theory. After reading the empirical articles, along with the popular press commentary, what are your thoughts on the concept, and how can we learn to be more critical of the theories we are using? So I'll get us started just with a sort of personal story that basically is my first encounter with grit as a concept. I was surprised it was actual empirical research out there on it. I didn't know that. I encountered it in a private school that I worked with. And one of the teachers there was very adamant about talking to the students about grit and how they needed to have grit. She was a dance instructor. She was a lovely person, but like pretty hardcore and assertive. And I just wasn't exactly sure how I felt about it. I didn't read the book or see any of the books prior to this class. And it just was this, without even looking at any of the other people who felt conflicted about it, I just felt conflicted about it. I've gone through a lot of difficult things in my time. Not as many as other, I know I've read now about, like what the effect is on like poverty stricken students and just students that face certain things. And I think that's where I feel the most discomfort. My current like community of practice, my local context that I work with students in Title I schools. And so reading the commentaries from the New Yorker and other commentaries where they talked about, it feels very not a concept you could apply equally across people that come from very different backgrounds. So there was that piece of it. I've also read growth mindset, like that's another, concept. And I'm sort of curious, I want to hear both of your, how that sort of ties into like what you think about grit. But I guess overall, I in reading the meta-analysis, it was really interesting how all the different holes were sort of poked through what was potentially presented as a theory. And I think that it's interesting again when someone in psychology presented something, published something as a theory, how quickly it was absorbed by other circles like education and industry, and you couldn't really stop that regardless if it was valid or not. In terms of how can we learn to be more critical, I think it honestly made me think about, sort of our IRB, but it's more the training we did to kind of prep us for how to be like ethical in what we're doing and really think about things, like in particular when it talked about her numbers when she was publishing and how she, and she responded in the NPR article about how she never meant to be misleading, but like, as researchers, like we have to take on that responsibility that, we are the authority, we're publishing something and people can take things a certain way. So I know I started this whole thing off sort of in a kind of a negative light. It's not to say that I don't think that there is value in perseverance and sticking with things. I just think as a whole, the weight of what she published and how it was then later perceived by people could potentially just have had negative consequences on large groups of students. And so that's concerning to me. But
yeah, I would say, Kelly is interesting. I actually, we read her book for a book club at the medical school, the network of medical schools that I'm a part of. Probably about a year or two ago. And I've heard Dr. Duckworth speak in person numerous times throughout my career. And it is interesting, I think, how concepts like grit can sort of get into the popular culture, because there's a piece of me that says that the way or the reason that happens is because a concept like grit like resonates with us in some sort of guttural level. Like, for instance, it struck me as I was reading through the materials for this week that one could argue that every single one of us in this cohort is gritty, because if you're not gritty, you're not going to make it through, right? In sort of almost like a colloquial sense of sort of approaching the concept. So then there's the, okay, but is there validity to this as a new concept? And it seems like that's really where most of the criticism has come from, is that perhaps this isn't, so aside from maybe some of the technicalities of how she published it, I think the deeper argument is this actually, you know, a novel or new concept? So she pulls out passion and perseverance as the two elements of grit, and says that grit is different than just passion alone or just perseverance alone. It's actually the combination of those two things that make up grit. But you know, when I led my book club, Kelly, most of the folks there working with med students had the same concern that you had, that we already know med students are burning out and have high rates of suicidal ideation. And then we're layering on top of it this concept of grit, which she sort of fundamentally defines as sticking with something for a really long period of time, right? And that this idea that as soon as I change careers or change course or make a different option, am I no longer gritty, or I'm not as gritty? And when we apply that in something like medical school, or maybe to any of us who are probably overachievers if we're already here, the minute we hear something like that says, well, I'm not as gritty, does that mean that I'm not as driven, or is it right? It's almost like a less than kind of approach. And so, you know, I do think there is some concern. It's almost like I like the idea, I like the verbiage on a certain level, but I become more and more uncomfortable with how she defines it as I go on. And just one little antidote, I had my 30th high school reunion last weekend, and I was having dinner with a classmate, and he's very entrepreneurial by nature. And so he has started restaurants, and he's won plein air painting contests, and he's done all these different things. And he said something to me at dinner, and he said, but you know, I don't stick with anything for more than 3 to 5 years because I'm curious and I have a lot I want to accomplish. But when I look at him, he's like one of the grittiest people I know, right? I mean, who starts and stops and sells restaurants and does paintings and does, but to her, according to Angela's definition, he'd probably score really, really low because he changes all the time. So I don't know. And then there's the whole, she only really researched overachievers to start with.
Selection bias.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think it's interesting. I think the three of us are probably going to land in the same space in terms of our critique of this work. I feel like my perspective into the conversation is that I was living in the world of youth development when her book was released, when all of her work was released. And so I do think, Kamara, like what you said, there's something that's attracted us to this. First of all, it's a great word, grit, you know, it just makes you feel like, yeah, like, you know, and in our culture, this individualistic, you know, streak of like, pull up your bootstraps, you get this done. I was just talking to this new person, side note, that I met the other day. And I said to him, you know, at MDC, we talk about talent is universal, but opportunity is not. And he says to me, do you believe that? I was like, say that again. What do you mean by that? And he's like, do you really think opportunity is not universal? What about people that work really hard? So you can imagine how that conversation went, right? Because I was just thinking like, wow, this isn't to me what I get from her conversation, which I think one of the reasons it was attractive at first was because it was like in the non-cognitive domain, like the fact that we were talking about non-cognitive factors, like, yay, this is not just about, you know, smart people. It's just not about cognitive ability and the development of cognitive ability, but a more complex conversation about the interrelationship and the interdevelopment, right, of non-cognitive or cognitive work or factors. But I think she really, for all of the reasons you guys talked about, you know, the way that I feel like, I do think that a lot of the psychological constructs that were in the history of this work are very much aligned, especially conscientiousness, which is the one that kept coming up. And I thought she really just took off. She became like this pop culture phenomenon, right? She just TED talked her way through, and probably a nice lady, although I've heard a few stories of people that have worked in her lab. But what gets to me is this issue of equity and this notion that, and it's a question that I really think about this all the time because I have actually put it into practice with my students. When I feel that all I need to show you is that you have grit, you come from a family of gritty people, particularly the students that I work with, students that are coming from other countries. Some of them have traversed boundaries, physical boundaries to get here. And we're going to talk about whether you're gritty or not.
Right.
And so I wonder, is grit not just teachable, but is grit transferable? Can we help students understand that they are already gritty in some domain of their life, and that it's about transferring that grittiness into academic success, because this is not their space. They don't know. And even if you were born and raised in this country, there's a lot of research that says the transition period from middle to high school and then from high school to college are the bumpiest times. So just being able to recognize what it means to be gritty in this space is what I really want to talk. I just find that to be very interesting. But the comments, I've read Paul Tuff's books, which he was identified in, he was mentioned in the New Yorker article. And I really enjoyed his books, and he comes at the whole conversation about this very differently. And he says, that when you start to introduce the elements of risk and protective factors, that's, I think, a more nuanced approach to talking about how grit is or isn't developed. And he says here, like, Paul Tuff introduces how the differences in one's upbringing, the acknowledgement of risk and protective factors being present, can have impact on the neurological architecture developing in young people, and then how that process directly impacts the development of key non-cognitive constructs such as perseverance. You can't develop perseverance when you're in fight or flight. And that comes from these, so it's like, that to me was a much more complex, sophisticated conversation around how we develop what we develop in order to be, quote, successful, as opposed to you're either gritty or you're not. You either stick with it or you don't. And so she kind of lost a lot for me as someone in the youth development field. Watching not just us, watching organizations across the country lose funding because, like, I think the article mentioned, and she was not a proponent of it, but like, the government just took to it. Like, let's start measuring it. Let's start teaching it. And it was really interesting how that construct just picked up like that. Like, people were losing, organizations were losing funding. KIPS schools were starting to build like their entire curriculum around this. And you couldn't hear that noise in the back around, like, this is not an equitable conversation. Like, you're completely missing the structural inequities that have everything to do with grit in this country, but it just wasn't addressed. So I found that's what I struggle with a lot too.
Yeah, I completely agree with you on all of the equity pieces and just the discomfort of like one more thing to measure, because I feel like already measurement standards sort of things have issues with certain things, and especially K-12 education, and that's part of like the research that I'm doing, even with like something like innovative and creative integration of technology training for educators. And some research I was looking at just this past week was saying one of the like common detractors from being able to be innovative in that space is the like focus on testing and scores and assessment, and that like just like sucks the life out of that. So another piece of that for me, like when they were talking about in the New Yorker, where it was talking about the career piece, in modern offices and how people work in teams, moving from one project to another, talking about if you're not adaptable, creative, and alert, and just like thinking about 21st century skills. I think about project-based learning, like based on like her presentation of grit, I don't think it was like very in a box and very prescribed. Yeah. And that whole list even of like, these are the like indicators, that sort of, I think just flies in the face of, for me, I think flies in the face of like design thinking and project-based learning. And it's not that there couldn't be elements that you could apply to it, but like in a very strict, defined sense of it, I think it does.
Yeah,
I think maybe that's the challenge. So listening to both of you talk, I mean, I think there's a place for perseverance or conscientiousness or an understanding that is a trait. I mean, Sandra, to your point, when I think of maybe more under-resourced individuals in my life, I will say that I have times where I can see that neurological space that hasn't been as developed, right? This immediacy of as soon as there's a a bump in the road to quit or to stop or to immediately feel like they are unable to move forward. So it's like, I don't want to throw everything out that is here. I just think I wish it had a broader definition, right? It just seems like the context is like career or
Yeah.
you know, or sports or the military, right? And I would like to see some broader application, which I think it's being suggested has maybe already been done. And Kelly, to your point, she has this interesting, which you're not going to be able to see, but she has this interesting part in her book where she starts to go over goal hierarchies. And she says, you know, one of the things that people who are gritty are really good at doing is determining some top level priority goals and then not allowing distraction away from those. And that people who tend to be less gritty or less successful, as she defines it, have all of these competing things that they like get distracted by, right? I actually did really appreciate, that construct of her sort of saying, listen, you have to constantly challenge yourself to be able to say, what's your passion? And what are you doing today? Where are you placing your energies to move towards that passion, right? And that people who she defines as gritty have this ability to do that. So I think there are some things that could be pulled out of it. But I think there's a huge warning here about really diving deep into things, especially when they become so popular so fast.
Yeah.
Agreed. Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, ladies. That is the end of our time for this discussion. So we will see you all next week. Hope you have a wonderful evening. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.